Welcome to the CRC Roundtable, a monthly virtual seminar series. Our intention is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances and management needs. The webinars, again, are designed for contribution, not consumption. And as a reflection of that, the intent, the panelists have been given collectively about 25 minutes to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for discussion, which gets facilitated out of the chat, as well as the questions that have been submitted beforehand. So this is all about us, giving us a place to be a little bit clumsy and to practice some bravery and humility. So let me start, as we always do, by talking about why this topic at this time by these speakers. Last month's roundtable took a deeper dive into one of the implications of the Science and Technical Advisory Committee's report that was titled Comprehensive Evaluation of System Response, affectionately referred to as CESR. If you haven't heard of CESR before, it's a 115-page report that contains scientific consensus of over 60 Chesapeake Bay watershed researchers on questions that range from the efficacy of non-point source management to the living resource responses that we are seeing or not seeing. The report, if you haven't seen it, can be found on the CRC website. CESR raised two opportunities that have received a lot of attention and discussion, and those opportunities are to address really the living resource question. That says to target water quality improvements to where and what people care about, and to supplement those water quality efforts with other management actions that can boost the living resource response to those water quality improvements. Last month's discussion focused exclusively on tidal wetlands and shorelines. And this month, I'm really excited. We widen our perspective of what that means, the where and what people care about, to include both rural and urban context and tidal and non-tidal waters. These speakers represent approaches that start really with different questions of what people care about, and then they engage different groups of stakeholders, and they do it in different contexts. So I'm really excited to hear their presentations. I'll just tell you a note about each that maybe you can't read in their titles, a little bit between the lines. Carly Dean is director of the Chesapeake Tributaries Initiative, and that really assists a wide variety of partners to figure out how to prioritize the right practices in the right places at the right scale to achieve measurable near-term conservation outcomes for and get this number, 100,000 small tributaries in the watershed. She does her work in a rural context and non-tidal waters. Taylor Lilly is the environmental justice staff attorney, and she works to develop not only litigation, but she also looks to the restoration and conservation actions that can improve those outcomes. While she works in all types of context, I think the work she's going to talk about mostly today is in an urban context and tidal waters, and they provide a wonderful contrast between the two of them. So with that, I think the ground rules are, again, if you can put your affiliation in the chat box, let us know who you are and where you're from. And then again, I will facilitate the discussion out of the chat and from the questions submitted beforehand. So with that, I will let Carly take the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the roundtable today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present and to share some information about a project that I've been working on for close to 7 or 8 years. I've been at the Conservancy for 9 years coming up in December. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. All right. So thank you, Denise, for that introduction. Again, my name is Carly Dean. I'm from Chesapeake Conservancy. Our organization's mission is all about advancing strong public and private partnerships, empowering environmental stewardship throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And one of the big things that we do at our organization is develop and use new technologies. Our organization is pretty well known for our Conservation Innovation Center, where we create high-resolution land use, land cover maps, and hydrography maps for the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So for today's presentation, I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on that data, because that really helped us launch our program here in Pennsylvania. And as I was reflecting on some of the questions that Denise and Lauren were asking to prepare for today, it really came down to scale. So scale is something that we think about in terms of geography, but we're also talking about the appropriate scale of restoration targets, timelines, and deliverables that have really been central to the program's success so far. So a little bit of background on this GIS data. Most of our organizations have something to do with water quality and improving stream health, wildlife habitat. When we first came out with the first round of high resolution land cover data that you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, this really gave us insight into how we can think about the interaction between what's happening on the landscape and what's ending up in our local creeks and streams. And this data was available for the first time at the 1 meter by 1 meter resolution scale, meaning at the project scale. And then we had the high resolution hydrography data that looked at topography to show how water is flowing across the landscape, picking up nutrient, sediment, pollution, and distributing it into our streams, resulting in poor water quality and wildlife habitat. So these two data sets together were really one of the first times that partners working on the ground could actually leverage GIS to identify priorities at the parcel scale. When I first started at the Conservancy, one of the things that I was tasked with was sort of helping to roll out the data. And when I met with folks working in Center and Clinton counties, which is right in the middle of Pennsylvania, near the State College area, there were people working in agricultural restoration that thought that this data could be really helpful for them to focus their work. So at the time, someone who worked at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation invited us into the community to talk about data with local restoration partners. Having that advocate was really key. Our organization's based in Annapolis, Maryland. So I'll say that having that local advocate for us who invited us in was really key. We had about 20 people attend the first meeting where we introduced the data, and we got input from the community on what problems that they thought that this data could solve. And one of the most important things is looking at the data at the right scale. So I talked about the hydrography data, which on the left-hand side of your screen here, you can see these sort of drainage areas that are mapped at the scale of an individual property. So looking at that drainage area, how runoff is flowing into the stream that is flowing through this property, looking at a 35-foot width along the edge of that stream and seeing if the land cover is showing that there's tree canopy or not. So making sure that scale is appropriate, because that's the way that we think about restoration projects, right? It's the King Farm or the Esch Farm or the school property where the actual restoration happens. The other thing that was really interesting in these meetings is that everyone who'd been working in this area for decades, everybody wants to work in the most important places, but sometimes we mean different things. So this mapping exercise gave us an opportunity to come up with this shared vocabulary. So we went through the exercise, we looked at parcels across the 2 counties. Eventually it ended up being 4 counties for this first round. And the result was this list of prioritized parcels where do we all agree we think the data tells us we should focus our restoration efforts. And I've got an Excel spreadsheet that I've printed out that we handed out to everyone. It's 90 pages long. And frankly, this was not actionable right out off the bat. We needed to figure out a way to scale down a little bit. This is really scattered. We're talking about thousands of properties across 4 counties. So when we asked partners, what's the best way to bring this down even to a more feasible approach, right? We're not going to put somebody in their car and have them drive around and knock on doors across this entire region. We need to focus. So when we surveyed our partners, they suggested that one of the strategies that would help us to tighten this approach is to work on impaired stream segments where there were several contiguous properties that looked like that one that I showed you on the previous slide, where it looked like there was sort of an outsized impact that this one property could have on the stream. So that really lined up with an idea that's really important in this central Pennsylvania area, which is the health of streams and fish and bug habitat. So we looked at the impaired streams, which are streams that are listed, designated as impaired in Pennsylvania's integrated water quality report. Every state has an integrated water quality report as part of the Clean Water Act. And the way that Pennsylvania designates streams as impaired is looking at fish and, looking at bug communities and also habitat characteristics, physical habitat evaluations. So the combination of the metrics that really resonate with people, fish and bugs, and the clear it's either impaired or it's not, were a really great driver for people to have a target that they're working toward, that they can explain easily, and that everybody agrees that fish and bugs are something that we want to work to improve. So when we first started, there were just over 40 segments in these two counties, or I'm sorry, in these 4 counties that were designated as impaired. And there are lots of different ways we could think about prioritizing the places where we wanted to work, but ultimately it came down to where the partners thought we could get the most momentum. Where are people already working? That they've got a lot of success. And again, this is about scale. When we had our first round of meetings to select from those 40 streams, the ones that we really wanted to hone in on, it's as simple as when we printed a map and put it out on the table, you had to be able to have it at a scale that you could see the properties that you're looking at. You could look at the aerial imagery and say, yeah, there's a road that comes through here. I remember doing a stream restoration project on this property. It's can be as simple as that, choosing the right scale that people can look at a map and resonate and interpret what they're looking at. So we ended up looking at stream segments that were between 1 and 5 miles in length. The area that is draining runoff into the stream segment, we're calling the catchment area. Those are about 1,000 to 5,000 acres in size. And we really wanted to focus in places that had, just a handful of those high priority properties where we could work. But again, going back to building on the momentum, this exercise took a lot of trust because you can only see so much from the air. The mapping only tells us so much, but it really was about the folks coming to the meeting prepared. We had people from the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources bring a big box of files with projects that they had worked on and tree planting projects that they had done. We had a conservation district manager that was getting ready to retire and brought a person in that was going to be replacing his position to introduce that person to folks and to learn about what was happening. This was a lot of great conversation, people reminiscing about projects that they had done in the past. And ultimately, those maps start to fill in with information of places where we had worked and places where we thought landowners might be willing to do outreach to their neighbors or move forward with projects. So that's generally kind of how we narrowed down to which streams we thought we could make the most progress in the shortest amount of time and get them to the state where those bug and habitat conditions were improved such that they would no longer be listed as impaired. That's where we talk about the delisting strategy. So delisted from Pennsylvania's list of impaired waterways. So we narrowed down our list of stream segments, and this is just another way of looking at this. So this is sort of a map of what one of these catchment areas would look like. The red line in the middle is the impaired segment that we're looking at. The dot, purple dot at the bottom is like sort of the pour point or the bottommost point that we're interested in looking at. We have these 3 things to consider. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these, but essentially, where do we have all of the relationships? where do we think we could make progress? It's all this combination of data and trust and a scale that's appropriate. And then setting restoration targets. So what is going to be feasible to happen in a 2 to 5 year time frame? The green in this graph shows this is a current status of one of the catchments, but the green shows projects that were completed. The gold shows landowners that are likely amenable to restoration, and the red line is our target. So setting targets that are feasible, and then also assigning different partners different roles in achieving these targets. So we now have this strategy underway across 7 counties in Pennsylvania. These are all streams that are impaired due to agricultural sources. There are 56 streams where we're focused, but we're not necessarily focused on all 56 at the same time. So we might have 2 organizations working together during one outreach season to get the top 10 farms to do outreach and all of the necessary follow-up with the farmers in a couple of catchments. So we're not doing all of them at once. We're continuing to break it down. As we're lining up this portfolio of projects, we're also working with partners to set fundraising targets across the region. We're aggregating projects into major grant proposals where the funding is then subawarded out to different groups. So we're becoming more competitive with our regional funding proposals. I mentioned distributing the workload across different organizations. For example, Trout Unlimited might do the in-stream habitat work. The Conservation District might do the barnyard restoration. We're also coordinating a monitoring program with research institutes to see how far along we are to achieving those delisting metrics. Let's see here. Okay, and I will say that just last month, Pennsylvania DEP released their draft 2024 integrated water quality report, and they're showing 4 stream segments within this strategy that are showing as preliminary delistings. So this strategy started in about 2019, 2020. The work had started way before that with partners who had been doing restoration on the ground, but we've got a public comment period for that integrated report. It would still need to be approved by the EPA, but we're showing a lot of progress so far. And I'll just sort of end by saying that this really takes a group like the Conservancy and also Lancaster Clean Water Partners in Lancaster to sort of usher things forward, make sure that we're staying flexible along the way. The GIS capacity was just the first part of it, but we're constantly tackling challenges to keep things moving forward, and they're always going to come up. But as long as everybody understands the target that we're working toward and their role in the process, then we're getting there, and it's exciting to see how much it's grown.
Great, Carly, thank you very, very much. And with that, again, we're going to facilitate the discussion at the end, so we'll move right away to Taylor.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but I do think that one of the themes I wanted to carry over from Carly's presentation is this concept of trust and working with communities and working towards a shared goal. It's one that I try to highlight a lot in my work, and I think one that speaks a lot to the success of, where we go from beginning. Okay, lots of the success of projects. So as Denise mentioned, I am the Environmental Justice Staff Attorney at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So I'm going to be speaking a lot today from kind of our approach to litigation and the approach that I have. And because of that, a lot of my perspective is grounded in the concept of environmental justice. So just so we have kind of a uniform language, this is the EPA's definition of environmental justice. And I know for a lot of folks, it can be a little bit of a niche practice, but it's actually pretty broad in its applications. Environmental justice sits at sort of the intersection of public health, environmental advocacy, and environmental restoration. And so too, by necessity, does our work. And as I mentioned, I work primarily in our litigation department, but a lot of folks at CBF work in the environmental justice approach area and aim to develop projects that address environmental justice concerns. And importantly, environmental justice has always been a community-led and driven piece of advocacy. It's one that was carried by communities since its outset. This is Warren County in the early 1980s in North Carolina, and it's one that environmental organizations continue to work to support, and one that CBF also works to support, and me through my work also at CBF. As I mentioned, a lot of departments within Chesapeake Bay Foundation are aimed at addressing environmental justice issues. Like I said, I will be talking a lot from my perspective as a litigator in that department, and I hope the folks in our environmental protection and restoration department and education departments will forgive me for this aggressive summarization of their work, but I just wanted to highlight that while the litigation piece can sometimes seem more active, some of the true benefits that translate for communities and also for the Bay come through the environmental protection, restoration work, and education work that happens outside of that. So as part of our work, I at least, and some of the other folks in the team work to sit in the sweet spot between achieving Bay restoration goals, but also highlighting community narratives and identifying projects that will help communities who have maybe been left out of the conversation or who have been in the gap between what we aim to do in terms of environmental restoration and what's missing so far. So a lot of our outreach comes from communities who have reached out to us directly or who have reached out to a partner who has then referred them to us. And so we try to go through this little roadmap. I will say the roadmap is not consistent. Sometimes we jump around for quite a bit or have to skip kick off a step, but ideally we're identifying individual communities who have responded to us and identifying who exactly we're working with. Sometimes the word community gets a little bit generalized, and so while you're saying you're working on behalf of an entire city, you might actually just be working with one or two individuals. The particular communities have different ideas, and so identifying who we're working to support and what those goals are have always been an important part of that advocacy. And identifying issues and the kind of verification step that we have, which is just to confirm that we have a role to play and whatever that concern might be, is one that we spend a lot of time on, and one that necessarily incorporates other departments and sometimes other folks in more restoration focused spaces. And just to pick up again on that trust component, a lot of the actual tangible work that gets done is tied directly to the way in which we approach conversations with community members and community engagement. And so in addition to just identifying those partners, having something as simple as a consistent method of communication has done leaps and bounds for the success of projects. A lot of communities that I'll say will light up on EJ screen as a traditional environmental justice community have what it would seem like an influx of interest from groups as of late. And that sometimes looks as like a one-off call where someone has a lot of energy and really wants to be supportive, but then they disappear or don't follow through with that support. And it gets to, there's a bit of fatigue that comes with that from communities who are excited and happy to receive a response to the concerns they've been raising for years, but frustrated with the fact that that response is inconsistent or doesn't actually translate or isn't clear or transparent in terms of what that work would actually accomplish or what an individual intends to do. And so all of our work is meant to happen in concert and in coordination with communities that we're aiming to assist. So this work doesn't happen on top of communities or in spite of them, and all of that. Everything that we aim to do is truly a partnership or in support of or in response to concerns that we've been hearing. And I've got this flexibility and adaptability point here as well, because it's oftentimes when we've identified an issue, there's kind of this preconceived notion of what success might look like, of what an ideal response to a concern, whether that's contamination, pollution, proposed projects might be, and that tends to limit conversations and the ability that folks feel like they have to engage in the conversation and share their own concerns. And so we always lean on the concept of flexibility and adaptability so that the conversation has room to shift and grow depending on what concerns we might hear or what we're able to provide or who our partners might be who are able to offer different solutions than us. And I just pulled this quote here because it was one of the kind of top points from a major case affecting environmental justice in the area that says environmental justice is not merely a box to be checked. And the context here is essentially that environmental justice advocacy is not a paper exercise. It's meant to be a integrated, on the ground, thorough analysis of what a community is so that an appropriate response can be given. And I think that's where the restoration movement has a lot to offer environmental justice advocacy and communities in general. The details around any particular area and what restoration might look like in that area and what an appropriate environmental response might be is really in those details. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of some projects where we found that overlap. And I hope everyone forgives me for my lawyer science, which is that I'm going to be pretty high level and not have a ton of detail, but hopefully a lot of folks on this call are either familiar or will clarify anything that I mess up here. So just to give a couple of examples of projects where we've identified an overlap between restoration, bay advocacy, and communities. First starts with municipal separate storm sewer systems, which is not, I think, top of mind for a lot of communities who are thinking about wanting to participate in environmental advocacy, but it's one that is front of mind for urban communities, especially when we're talking about stormwater and increases in precipitation that are exacerbating those storm system events. CBF recently participated in litigation with Blue Water Baltimore and with local residents in Baltimore City in response to the most recent MS4 permit that was issued for Baltimore City and Baltimore County and a couple of other jurisdictions, but these particular cases were Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And part of that goal was identifying pollution control reduction measures. Those MS4 permits have components that address how the stormwater we manage in an effort to translate to positive trends in the Bay and in the Patapsco and Back River watershed, so in those smaller stream sections. And so we engage in part because of those environmental concerns and because of in an effort to address some of the pollution reduction goals that were intended to be met, but also because MS4 system, we noticed that the MS4 system and stormwater in general was having an impact on communities. We had interacted and developed, again, a trust relationship with the community in North Baltimore who had frequently been experiencing extreme flooding. And while that's not necessarily a surprise for a lot of folks, it was a surprise for them because they're nowhere near any particular water feature. So they had no river or stream that was overflowing. Their street was just overflowing every time it rained. And they were a bit in the gap because, as you'll notice, this screenshot off to the side is the climate and economic justice screening tool that the Biden administration recently put out. And right in this gap, it says that they are in the 35th percentile, I think, for or 37th percentile for projected flood risk. And that is assessed based on proximity to, to water features. So because they are nowhere near any water features, they show up as a community that's technically safe. But based on these pictures that you see also on the other side, that's not at all the case. They've received enough water in this community to float and stop a city bus. Folks have lost cars, lost pets, have had water come up through their first floor, and that's all representation of stormwater. And it's also an example of the gaps that we try to address, because when there's a gap in enforcement, especially where community is concerned, sometimes that also means there's a gap in the restoration goals we're able to achieve. And so this community is kind of excision from the picture of what stormwater management might look like, or flooding might look like, also translates to an entire unaccounted area of runoff that impacts and lessens our ability to be able to meet some of those restoration goals. And that's something that we aim to highlight in this case. This is also true in terms of siting. So this is a side-by-side, and this is old EJ screen. Anyone who's been on EJ screen lately will know it looks a little bit different. This is an older poll, but this is a side-by-side of Portsmouth, Virginia. One side shows Superfund proximity, and the other side shows their demographic percentiles. Portsmouth is in the 99th percentile, and there are about 9 Superfund sites in a 15-mile radius. And the proliferation of these sites and the overconcentration of them is pretty typical and characteristic of environmental justice communities, and where polluters, where harmful environmental projects have been allowed to or have been able to continue to exist in a way that's harmful to communities. And so for a long time, the conversation that communities knew in this area was that they were concerned. They felt as though the toxics in this area were impacting their health. They still feel that way. And the cleanup process for a lot of these sites that have been identified has been ongoing for about 60 years. But that also translates to a gap in what's able to be done in terms of restoring these areas. One of the Superfund sites, the Peck Iron and Metal site, is on the Paradise Creek, or right next to Paradise Creek in this area, and contaminants from the site have translated to a detection of contaminants in groundwater, soil, and fish in the area. So a little bit earlier, Carly talked about those identifiers, those like the bugs and animals being able to say what's been happening. The community has had their narrative and their oral history of what they've known to be happening, and the environment has been reflecting that in terms of contamination that's still determining. And so this is a project that we continue to engage on and work with the community to support, but just another example of how identifying projects that begin as community stories also translates to restoration objectives and what we're able to achieve in terms of limiting pollution. This particular area is also one that's high on our engagement list because Portsmouth and Norfolk are also very susceptible to climate change increases in precipitation and flooding. A lot of these sites are obviously vulnerable sites, so any increase in flooding or sea level rise will also destabilize and lead to a distribution of contaminants potentially from these sites. I think that there's a fun tool that you can pull up that shows what might happen with different levels of sea level rise. And this area shows up as major concern because all of these toxic resources that are in various stages of cleanup will also translate to additional harm for communities who are dealing with resiliency issues. And then this last project is not a litigation project, but it's just too good of an example of kind of the combination of focused advocacy and achieving bay restoration goals for me not to highlight. This is a project that was highlighted, buoyed, carried out by our Virginia office and our grassroots advocacy team in Richmond. And it aimed to address a climate change related concern of urban heat islands in Southside Richmond. And so a lot of folks probably know urban heat islands are a result of a lack of tree cover and green cover. It leads to increased heat in areas throughout cities, mostly urban areas where there isn't a lot of that green cover. But a lack of tree cover also means a lack of stormwater mitigation. Just to throw it back to MS4, it also means a lack of a way to reduce pollutants that are running through, and also attributes to air quality in an area. And so our Virginia office partnered with Southside Relief, a local community, to get 650 trees planted in Southside Richmond as a way to address not only the environmental concerns in that area, but also respond to the community's concerns about what they were feeling as the impacts of climate change. And those trees just don't go just along the James River. They also go in throughout the community in areas where there are smaller tributary streams that feed the James River. And so it's just a good kind of connection between what shallow water conservation, shallow water restoration, and community engagement has the capability to achieve. Not all projects, I think, that have the potential to have significant impacts are necessarily large-scale litigation. A lot of them are direct community involvement and engagement. And this is just another example of, again, relying on that trust relationship and the conversations and what success might look like for a community, because this was one that's completely unattached to litigation, but I think the community and even our Virginia office agree that it's one that has translated to a lot of success. And that I will stop there.
Oh, thank you, Taylor. Thank you both. It's a really interesting contrast. Let me start off with just what should be an easy question for Carly to sort of get that off the table in the chat. Matt Pluta asked, do each of those stream segments have their own local TMDL?
Not each of them. So I would say about 2/3 of them are within a watershed that does have a TMDL, but they're in various stages of actually developing the WIP to implement. So no is the answer.
Okay,
Simply.
great. All right, let me ask something that came up, and I'm interested by the examples you gave, and Taylor might ask you to answer this first, and then Carly. It seems that if you're looking at sort of the interaction or the alignment of Chesapeake Bay restoration goals, local concerns, and climate resiliency, your projects, it seems pretty easy for projects to basically hit all those buttons. Is that your observation, that it's just not that hard to find places where these local issues really do have significant sort of bay restoration benefits as well as some climate resiliency in them?
No, I think that perhaps the things that I've been able to highlight in the projects I've worked on are almost like an over-representative sample, because that's the goal that at least through my work and through a lot of departments that I get the chance to work with at CBF, that's what we're trying to do. And those are the projects that I'm searching out. And so those are the projects that I've been able to identify and support, but I don't think it's just as easy as, if you look, you will find a lot of the projects that, even this over-representative sampling, are a result of long-term relationship building, identification. There are a lot of projects that don't make it into these presentations because they were either not the right fit, or we couldn't be supportive, or there wasn't something that immediately we could address. And so these are the most applicable projects, but I think that it's really a lot of trial and error and conversation. And I think that's kind of why I highlighted that flexibility and adaptability piece, because sometimes there are good places to engage and to partner, and sometimes there are good times to identify other partners or other approaches. So like I said, this is over-representative of of the capabilities out there, but just to give folks an example.
Yeah, and I think just to remind everybody that you're working in the context of Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and so they don't even get to your, on your screen, right, unless there's a tie to Chesapeake Bay restoration work, so to speak. Carly, how about you? How difficult is it? Does for example, the 30 by 30 initiative sort of naturally come to places where those three things align? A local concern, a bay restoration goal, and some climate resiliency?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different ways to think about it. So 30 by 30, I don't know if I specifically defined that when I was going through, but we're working in 56 streams. The goal is to delist 30 of the streams by the year 2030. So 30 by 30 for the stream delisting part of it. You may have heard that phrase in other contexts, but so the places where we're working in general, when we talk about a farm restoration project, that restoration project is attempting to address all of the resource concerns on the farm. So it can be anything from conservation tillage, which has, climate benefits. We'll definitely do manure storage and other barnyard work, which is going to reduce the nutrient input into the stream, nitrogen and phosphorus inputs into the stream. We're going to do in-stream restoration, which will improve the bug and fish habitat, and that's going to address sediment. All of these things are important for bay goals. Not all of our geographies align with like the most effective basins, which you may have heard about through, the places that are delivering nitrogen and phosphorus effectively down to the deeper portions of the bay. But the practices in general, our philosophy is, if we can restore the individual headwaters tributaries, then all of those benefits sort of flow downstream. And it's a way to break this entire bay program, down into bite-sized chunks.
Oh, thank you. You both talk so eloquently, really, about the importance of grassroots organization and community. And we talked beforehand about, each of your work requires there to be, I don't know if we call it, social and civic infrastructure. We call it momentum, I think. You referred to it, Carly. How do you assess the level of, let's call it momentum? How do you assess the level of momentum, and if that makes it a place where you think you can get a lot of benefit from doing some work? And maybe I'll switch the order and ask Carly if you want to respond first, and then Taylor.
Sure. So for the way that we've set up these implementation targets, so I showed the bar graphs that had those red lines. Those were our targets. So for example, we want to address resource concerns on 80% of the farmland within that catchment area to that stream. So what we do is we look at, well, how many properties is that? Which properties? And then that helps us say, well, from a momentum standpoint, well, if there's 8 properties, we've already done work on 4 of them, and we know the other 4 landowners are interested. So by setting those targets, that tells us, is there enough momentum to get this work done within a 5-year period? Or are we really starting from scratch? Or do we know that there are some landowner holdouts that we're never going to be able to, or not never, but not within our 5-year implementation target? So by setting those like measurable targets, that really helps us determine, is it enough momentum to push forward, or do we just not have enough here and we want to focus our resources elsewhere?
Oh, great. Thank you. Taylor, how about you? How do you sort of assess momentum?
It's actually a pretty unscientific answer. It's really just conversation every time, a particular issue or community comes up. It's sometimes momentum looks different depending on what the community is. Momentum, I've highlighted a lot of urban projects, but sometimes momentum looks different in a rural area than it does in an urban area in terms of who's available, what kind of capacity they have, what kind of opportunities there are for engagement throughout the process in terms of engaging with regulators at all different kinds of levels. So it's always just a really long conversation. And I think it's also probably one of the more enjoyable parts of the work is really getting to know a community and know who's got capacity, and also being able to lend capacity to them where they feel like they've developed as much momentum as they can. So like I'm having as many meetings in my community as I can. I feel like I've sent all the letters I can. What else is there left to do? And so in that way, we're able to in some cases, add to that momentum and be another piece of what that kind of civic infrastructure is. And the assessment really is just who's available, what are the concerns, can we be supportive, and is there a role for us here? And if there's not, is there a role for someone else? And if it's not a question of an outside partner, how can we share things that we've learned with this particular group, organization, entity, so that they can keep going down this path?
Oh, that's interesting. So that there's you'll even do a handoff if it's not you and somebody else might suit the issue better. You go ahead and do that. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more interesting features that I'm new to the Bay watershed in a sense, but it's one of the things that I've noticed about this community is that the partnership is really one of the strengths, and so we've been able to work with a lot of different organizations and share knowledge, or take step backs, or refer people to other organizations where appropriate, because the solutions in communities that are either experiencing an environmental injustice or have a particular environmental concern are not one-off, they're not one size fits all, and litigation in particular is not always the best fit. And so that sometimes means not only going outside of the litigation mindset at CBF, but even outside CBF, especially when we're talking about things that are maybe outside our immediate watershed, thinking into like the northern parts of Pennsylvania or farther out in Virginia, places where the issue is definitely ripe for engagement, but not necessarily ripe for CBF engagement.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. Hey, Kristen, I knew my friend Kristen Saunders would show up with a question. And you can decide who could answer it first. Is there durability built into your projects, either through long-term easements or agreements that ensure these investments and improvements are maintained into the future? Whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, I can answer that from the perspective of the farm restoration projects. So when we talked about momentum and existing relationships, a lot of the partners that we work with are local land trusts and conservancies. So we're often starting with properties that are already in like ag easements. So that's built in some ways into the program, which is great, knowing that there's going to be, long-term preservation of these properties. A lot of the funding that we use through the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources or through NRCS does also require a landowner agreement. So that could be 15 years or so. But really looking at that catchment scale and setting conservation targets, like really protecting these, like the work that we've put in is a huge priority for the partnership now. we're kind of building it as we go. But some of that's built in, some of that needs to be more deliberate. We probably are going to be starting to set like preservation and conservation targets and make another bar graph going into the future so we can sustain those benefits.
Mm-hmm. Taylor, do you want to add anything?
I would just say, similarly to Carly, the durability is project dependent, and so our ability to maintain long-term engagement depends on the result that we're trying to achieve. So, for example, the Grading Southside Richmond project has durability in the sense that it's a grant that we received in coordination with the community in order to do, and so there's durability in the sense of identified terms and deliverables that will come from that project. And then in some cases, durability is in the form of representation agreement, where very clear identified goals on what that might look like throughout litigation. And so it's very dependent, but I think overall, some of the durability that comes with the work is like soft durability, relationship management, maintaining relationships throughout, so that those relationships exist past projects or past individual actions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kathleen, I guess Michelle's or Michael's has asked a very interesting question. And Kathleen, I apologize, I won't be able to answer it probably in the specificity that you're asking, but she's raising an interesting issue, which is she's concerned about thousands of acres of plastic synthetic turf, both replacing native vegetation and the source of sort of PFAS or plastics that it might represent. And I'm going to make it a little bit broader and sort of ask you, maybe Taylor first, how often your projects are look at other concerns that have living resource impacts other than nutrients and sediment. So do you get projects that are really dealing with things like plastics or toxics in that way?
Yeah, and I think the Portsmouth example is a good example of this, because those toxics translate to harmful impacts, but they're not necessarily nitrogen, sediment, phosphorus focused. The things that flag for us are those things, but toxics are obviously, in addition to those are top three harmful to the bay and also harmful to human health, and that also extends to a big piece of our work that I didn't touch on, which is all of our air work. And so a lot of that work speaks to emissions and particles that will travel far enough to reach the bay and deposit into the water and affect that, which again is still nitrogen, but also PM 2.5, a really small particle that gets lodged in your lungs, but also gets deposited into the bay. And so it's a holistic conversation. I think that while nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment are top of mind for us, it's a bigger conversation to include all of the potential environmental contaminants that are affecting communities, but also affecting restoration. And so we always get back to that point, but certainly all of our projects have and also have the ability to go just beyond those kind of top three.
Carly, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I think that one of the ways that this could come up eventually in our programs, we're not looking at that right now, but we do have an in-stream monitoring program with our partners, in particular Susquehanna University, where we're tracking the progress toward that delisting by looking at the bug communities. We're focused on agricultural restoration practices, but it's not unlikely that we'll find that the bug communities in certain streams aren't improving the way that we thought, and partnering with some of the universities to better understand, well, what else could be happening in these streams. We're talking about there could be other things that are happening in these streams that are resulting in them not improving, and that's a good research question and opportunity to start thinking about that. And I'll also say that, this program that I've talked about today is just focused primarily on those bug communities, but the strategy where we talk about setting these targets and working in these smaller scales, I think could address any type of contaminant that we're interested in. It's all about tying those contaminants to that sort of environmental outcome that we're looking for at the right scale. So I do think that there's a way to set up a program in a similar structure with a different environmental outcome that we're working toward.
I have a kind of a follow-up question just to remind people. We make an effort, any question that does not get addressed in the webinar, we forward to our panelists and give them a chance to answer in writing, and you get those responses back. But Carly, let me ask you this question. One of your criteria is attainability. And so could you talk about the interaction between balancing, you're working on things that are relatively close to attainability, but may not have as big of a living resource boost as you might want if you went to places that were further from attainability. So that's been a little bit of a question about your rapid stream delisting program. Can you just sort of address that, how you're balancing that? And maybe you are feeling like you're getting the most living resources sort of lift that you can.
Yeah, so when we first started looking, I showed you that map that had the 4 counties and all of the properties like shown in the different colors. The red color was the highest priority of places we want to work. And the way that looked at it was, where are the places where we could expect to see the greatest improvement? Also, like where properties having the greatest sort of negative impact to the stream. And what we decided, what the partners decided, we spent months kind of figuring this out with the partners, is that we really needed some wins. We really needed to show short-term progress, that delisting is, again, it's either impaired or it's not impaired. It's either impaired or attaining as sort of the opposite. And by working in places where we could get that, have that tangible win of working as hard as we can over a 5-year time frame, getting those streams delisted in a relatively short amount of time. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years of impacts on these streams. So 10 years is pretty short. That was really a big driver here, was supporting communities to get something that can be celebrated, that can be measured. The longer term goal continues to be a priority, but we're trying to get shorter term wins to help maintain that momentum and keep spirits high, because it's been tough in the agricultural community in Pennsylvania for many years.
Oh, thanks. Taylor, do you, this is probably maybe a little bit outside your area because you've made the handoff, but do you get the sense, or in the projects that you've talked about, do you think you're getting significant living resource lift when you go after these environmental justice projects?
I think so. I think anytime we're able to direct resources and attention to a problem that maybe hasn't been addressed through typical enforcement, that's going to translate to a positive impact, because the previous point of engagement was minimal, maybe even in zero, and so some direction of resources will necessarily translate to a positive uptick. And for example, in Henrico County, there's now $1 million environmental project that is a result of engagement and litigation that will translate to environmental benefits, and whose entire goal is to translate to environmental restoration benefits in the James River Basin. And so that's the hope. I like to feel confident in saying a strong yes, and that's typically the goal of engaging in these projects, is to see not only a translation of benefits for immediate local resource, but also see that reflected in public health and quality of life for communities who are existing right next to that harmful issue.
Let me ask a question. This probably is just specific to Carly, maybe not, but and then I'm just as a forewarning, I'm going to ask you each to kind of leave us with a parting thought or something that you're committed to us, taking away from this. Jim Uphoff has asked, are any of the Pennsylvania projects dealing with the conversion of farms to development? If so, how? And if not, why not? Any thoughts on keeping rural land rural rather than dealing with increasingly difficult restoration with development? It's a great question.
It's a tough question. So most of the places where we're working have not had a huge threat of development in the short amount of time that I've been looking at the catchment areas. But there certainly are some, in particular in Lancaster County, that are intentionally selected because they are on an interface between a more developed area and a rural area. So this is something that we haven't yet worked through as a partnership. And it's just one example of how we have to keep, we get this plan in mind, we get this idea, and then there's constantly going to be things that we haven't thought about at first. So it actually is, and someone mentioned also the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership. This is something that even just in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be sitting down with folks to figure out how do we want to, again, protect the work that we've done to restore, and also ensure that we're thinking about the future and how we expect these landscapes to change, not only as a result of development, but also as climate impacts. So yeah, it's just another thing that I showed you, that little mountain, that hiker. It's just another thing that needs to go on there.
Let me ask a question just for Taylor to balance that out. Taylor, how do you measure success in your work? And it's a combination of litigation and conservation with different timescales and different results. But how do you, in general, measure success?
I know I kind of sound like a broken record, but I feel like it all just comes back down to the community. Success for me is usually when the community feels like we have supported them in achieving a goal or addressing a concern that they have. And so sometimes that might be a positive outcome, and sometimes that success is just being heard, having a partner in the process. And so anytime we're able to develop a good relationship with a community and support them in their endeavors and help elevate their narrative into this broader conversation we have about restoration and saving the bay, is a success for me. And I think anytime they feel like they have succeeded and that they've been able to achieve their goals, I share in the background in that success as well.
Great. And maybe I'll ask you, Taylor, first. What would you like everyone to sort of take away? Any final words?
I think what's become clear from this conversation is that there is a lot of potential in developing relationships with, I would say, almost non-traditional partners in this environmental movement. And there's a lot of potential for continuing to push the movement forward and restoration goals forward by expanding who we invite into these conversations and talk about those goals. And so just encourage all of us to keep developing those relationships and talking to each other, because it seems like there's potential for an increased oversampling of successful projects and that address climate change and community resiliency.
Oh, great. How about you, Carly?
I think one of my big takeaways is that for groups like Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Chesapeake Conservancy, we're providing support to local communities in many of these projects, whether it's technical support like what I do or more advocacy. I think that it's just really important to stick around, to not just deliver resources to folks, but make sure that you're there to help see it through, because there's going to be so many different changes and things coming up where there's going to be something else that prevents you from implementing the idea that you had years ago. And you just have to be flexible and nimble and stay with those communities as they're working toward those restoration outcomes.
Great, thank you. Thank you to both our panelists. In the spirit of the upcoming holiday, I'm incredibly grateful for the work everybody does, and for your willingness to be really open and honest and share. So have a good holiday, everyone, and we will see you on Wednesday, December 13th for the next CRC Roundtable.